Grace Hamilton, CEO of Horizon Airways. A routine business trip turns into something far more profound when a chance encounter at the airport lounge puts her principles and her patience to the test. What begins as an ordinary afternoon quickly unravels when Grace finds herself the target of suspicion and entitlement. The situation escalates, leaving everyone in the room watching as Grace remains calm, under fire. But what will unfold when she is forced to confront not only bias, but also the ripple effect of her response? In a story filled with unexpected turns, moments of quiet resilience, and a few surprising acts of courage, Grace's journey becomes more than just about defending her place. It becomes about redefining what leadership truly means. Will her grace and determination be enough to inspire change in those around her? Or will the weight of prejudice prove too heavy to overcome? The soft hum of conversations, the occasional clatter of glassware, and the steady whir of coffee machines filled the first-class lounge at Starlight International Airport. The space exuded luxury with its modern leather seating, polished marble floors, and panoramic windows showcasing planes taxiing in the distance. Amid the gentle rhythm of travel, Grace Hamilton walked in, embodying an effortless blend of confidence and elegance. Her tall, slender frame was accentuated by a tailored navy blue pantsuit, while her pearl earrings gleamed subtly beneath the warm lighting. Her caramel brown skin had a natural glow, a quiet testament to her composure amid life's storms. Grace was no stranger to attention, though she rarely sought it. She had built Horizon Airways from the ground up, yet in some circles, her presence still raised eyebrows. As she moved toward the lounge's seating area, her assistant, Eric Daniels, hurried to her side. Eric, a detail-oriented young man with neatly combed hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carried a sleek tablet filled with reports. "Here are the briefings for the investor meeting in Dallas, Miss Hamilton," he said, extending the device with a slight smile. "Thank you, Eric," Grace replied, her voice calm and warm. She appreciated his diligence and knew that, despite his quiet demeanor, Eric admired her greatly. They chose a corner table near the expansive windows, offering a clear view of the runway. Grace placed her leather briefcase, a gift from her late father, on the table, running her hand over its worn handle as she took a seat. It was a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. "After the meeting, we will review the growth strategy proposal," she said, opening the file with practiced ease. Eric nodded, taking out his notes. As Grace began to scan the reports, a ripple of whispers drifted from a nearby seating area. She felt the weight of eyes on her. She had experienced this silent scrutiny before: the curious glances, the quick judgments disguised as casual interest. She chose to remain composed, her attention focused on the task at hand. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a woman approaching. The woman was in her mid-40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of entitlement that preceded her. She wore an expensive floral scarf draped over her shoulders and clutched a designer handbag that hung from her arm like a trophy. "Here we go," Eric muttered under his breath, sensing trouble. Grace gave him a small, reassuring nod, though her instincts agreed. The woman, Diane Cooper, stopped several feet away, glancing at Grace as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that did not fit her worldview. Then, with a haughty pivot, Diane marched toward the front desk, where a young lounge attendant named Emily stood. Grace watched the exchange unfold without shifting in her seat. Diane pointed in Grace's direction and leaned in to speak to Emily. Though the words were indistinct, the intent was clear. Emily hesitated, glancing nervously between Diane and Grace. She was a new hire, her posture stiff with inexperience and uncertainty. After another pointed remark from Diane, Emily gathered her courage and approached Grace. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily began, her voice shaking slightly. "May I see your boarding pass and lounge credentials?" Eric stiffened, indignant, but Grace raised her hand subtly, signaling for patience. Grace closed the report slowly and looked up, her gaze steady but kind. "Of course, Grace replied. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a sleek, black card embossed with the Horizon Airways logo and the words, Owner's Pass. She held it out with grace, letting the gold lettering catch the light. Emily's eyes widened as she took the card, realizing who she was speaking to. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. I am so sorry, Miss Hamilton, Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not realize. It is all right, Grace said calmly, though there was a quiet weight behind her words. What matters now is how we handle it moving forward. Before Emily could respond, a tall man in a tailored suit strode toward them. Mr. Caldwell, the lounge manager, was a composed man known for his professionalism. He recognized Grace immediately and inclined his head respectfully. Miss Hamilton, he greeted her warmly. I apologize for any inconvenience. Your presence here is, of course, unquestionable. Diane, who had been watching from a distance, paled visibly. The realization that Grace was not merely a passenger, but the owner of the airline, unraveled her composure. She stepped forward, flustered but defiant. Well, how was I supposed to know? Diane blurted, attempting to reclaim some semblance of control. She was sitting here like an ordinary person. Grace's lips curved into a small, measured smile. And what should I have been doing, Mrs. Cooper? She asked, her voice calm yet pointed. Announcing my presence to everyone with a sign? Diane flushed, opening her mouth but finding no reply. Caldwell's jaw tightened as he addressed Diane directly. Mrs. Cooper, Miss Hamilton is the CEO and founder of this airline, he said firmly. Her access is beyond question. I suggest you reconsider your assumptions in the future. A hush fell over the lounge as passengers watched the scene unfold. Diane's indignation dissolved into a nervous muttering as she gathered her things and retreated toward the exit, her confidence punctured. Emily looked close to tears. I am so sorry, Miss Hamilton, Emily repeated, her voice cracking. Grace's gaze softened as she met the young woman's eyes. Mistakes happen, Emily, she said gently, but the important thing is what we learn from them. Emily nodded, visibly relieved, though she still looked shaken. Caldwell stepped forward again. I will ensure this does not happen again, he said. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I trust you will follow through. With that, she returned to her seat, signaling the end of the conversation. Eric let out a breath he had been holding, still visibly agitated. You handled that better than I ever could, Eric murmured. Grace gave him a reassuring smile as she reopened the report. Eric, she said softly, resilience is not about avoiding storms. It is about knowing you can weather them. He nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. As the lounge returned to its quiet hum, Grace felt a familiar mixture of weariness and resolve. This was not the first time she had faced prejudice, nor would it be the last. But she had long since learned that every challenge carried within it the opportunity for growth for herself and for those around her. She returned her focus to the report, her mind already turning toward the meeting ahead. Today's storm had passed, but she knew that the work of building something better was only just beginning. The lounge slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the soft murmur of conversations, the distant clinking of coffee cups, but the energy in the room was different. Though Diane had retreated, Grace could still feel the weight of unspoken questions lingering in the air. She glanced out the window at the runway, gathering herself. That was intense, Eric muttered, as he organized the documents on the table. I still cannot believe people act like that. Grace gave a slight nod, though her mind was already moving ahead. She knew that incidents like these were rarely isolated, and they left ripples long after the surface had calmed. Eric, she said gently, turning to her assistant, this is not new for me, but I learned a long time ago that how I respond shapes the narrative. People like Diane expect anger. They expect me to lose control so they can feel justified. Instead, I stay calm and choose my words carefully. That is how we win. Eric exhaled slowly, absorbing her words. I just wish you did not have to deal with it at all, he muttered. Grace offered a small smile, though the ache in her heart was real. So do I. But wishing does not change the world. Action does. A soft chime interrupted their conversation. Eric glanced at his phone and raised an eyebrow. Your flight is on schedule, he said, but there is still some time before boarding. Grace nodded, appreciating the moment to breathe. As Eric excused himself to grab coffee, Grace leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. The hum of the lounge became a distant murmur as memories bubbled up. The long nights spent drafting business plans in her tiny apartment, the uphill battle for funding, the skeptical glances from boardrooms dominated by people who had never expected someone like her to succeed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. Miss Hamilton? Grace opened her eyes and saw Emily, the young attendant, standing hesitantly by the table. Her hands were clasped nervously in front of her, and her cheeks were still flushed with embarrassment. Yes, Emily? Grace said kindly, gesturing for her to step closer. Emily took a small step forward. I just wanted to apologize again, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel awful about what happened. I should have handled it better. Grace studied her, noting the genuine remorse in her eyes. She saw not just nervousness, but a deep desire to make things right. Emily, Grace said gently, you were put in a difficult position. I understand that. What matters is what you do moving forward. Emily nodded quickly, her eyes bright with determination. I promise I will do better. I want to be fair and treat everyone with respect. I let her words get in my head. Grace's expression softened. We have all been there. The important thing is that you are willing to reflect and grow. Emily hesitated for a moment, then said, Thank you for your kindness, Miss Hamilton. I have heard so much about you, and now I understand why people admire you so much. Grace smiled warmly. Kindness costs nothing, Emily, but it can make all the difference. Emily nodded, a small but sincere smile on her face, before excusing herself. As Grace watched her return to the front desk, a thought settled in her mind. Perhaps this moment, though uncomfortable, would plant seeds of growth in Emily's career. Eric returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of Grace. Look at you, he said with a grin. Even after all that, you still have time to make someone's day better. Grace took a sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. If we cannot make space for growth, what are we really working for? Eric was about to respond when they both noticed a familiar figure at the entrance of the lounge. Diane Cooper was back, though this time she was speaking intently to someone on her phone. Her face was flushed with frustration, and her gestures were animated. Eric sighed heavily. I really hoped that would be the last we saw of her. Grace's eyes remained steady as she watched Diane. People like her rarely walk away quietly, she murmured. She is not finished yet. Sure enough, Diane ended her call and began walking purposefully toward the lounge desk. Grace saw her exchange a few words with another staff member, her voice rising just enough to carry over the hum of the room. Diane's face was a mask of defiance, and Grace recognized the telltale signs of someone doubling down rather than reflecting. Eric shifted uneasily. Do you think she is trying to stir things up again? Grace set her coffee down and folded her hands calmly. Probably, but the truth is on our side, Eric. People like Diane cannot stand to be wrong, but we do not have to meet them at their level. Moments later, Mr. Caldwell reappeared, walking toward Grace with a serious expression. Diane trailed behind him, looking flustered but resolute. Miss Hamilton, Caldwell said, his tone respectful but tense. Mrs. Cooper has some concerns she would like to address. Diane interjected before he could continue. I am not trying to cause trouble, she declared, though her tone suggested otherwise. But I have every right to express my concerns. Grace met Diane's gaze calmly, though her heart remained steady. Of course you do, she said, her voice smooth as silk. But there is a difference between expressing concerns and perpetuating false assumptions. Diane hesitated, taken aback by Grace's composure. She faltered, then straightened her shoulders. I only wanted to ensure the lounge policies were followed. Mrs. Cooper, Caldwell said gently but firmly, you have been informed that Miss Hamilton's credentials are not only valid, but exemplary. There is nothing more to question. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but then closed it again, clearly struggling to find a rebuttal. Grace leaned forward slightly. Diane, she said, using the woman's first name deliberately, sometimes the best way to move forward is to admit when we have made a mistake. It is not weakness, it is strength. For a moment, Diane's eyes flickered with something that almost looked like doubt. The room held its breath as an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, Diane huffed softly, turning on her heel. This is not over, she muttered as she walked away. Eric watched her retreat with a mixture of relief and frustration. Unbelievable, he muttered. Grace's gaze followed Diane briefly before she turned back to Eric. Some storms take longer to pass, she said thoughtfully, but they all pass eventually. Eric shook his head, still amazed by her calm demeanor. You really believe that, do you? Grace smiled. I have to. It is how we keep moving forward. As the lounge quieted once more, Grace felt a deeper sense of resolve settle over her. This was not the end of Diane's attempts to reclaim control, but it was only the beginning of how Grace would rise above it. The moments after Diane's departure felt like the calm after a distant rumble of thunder, temporary, but not yet peaceful. Grace could still sense the unsettled energy lingering in the lounge. Conversations resumed, but hushed, as though people were processing what they had just witnessed. She returned to her coffee, though the warmth of it did little to dissolve the tension that hung in the air. Eric shifted in his chair, scrolling through his tablet in an effort to regain focus, but his restless movements betrayed his frustration. She just does not quit, he muttered. What do people like Diane even gain from all this? Grace set her coffee down gently. Sometimes, Eric, people who cannot build something for themselves feel compelled to tear others down. But our goal is to stay steady, not let them dictate our path. Eric nodded, though his expression was tight with irritation. Still, it makes my blood boil. Grace gave him a reassuring look. That is exactly why staying calm matters. If we respond with anger, we lose sight of what we are trying to build. Just as she spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Mr. Caldwell was returning, but he was not alone. Diane trailed behind him, her face pale but set with determination. A small, uneasy murmur rippled through the room as people noticed her return. Miss Hamilton, Caldwell began carefully as he reached their table. Mrs. Cooper has some additional questions. Eric's grip tightened on his tablet, but Grace remained composed, her hands folded loosely on the table. Diane stepped forward, though her attempt to appear calm was betrayed by the tremble in her voice. I am not here to cause trouble, she began, though her tone carried an edge of defensiveness. I just find it unfair, even that someone with so much influence could be mistaken for an ordinary passenger. Eric looked incredulous, but Grace raised her hand slightly to calm him before he could speak. Grace's gaze was steady as she addressed Diane. Mrs. Cooper, influence does not make anyone more or less deserving of respect. Every passenger here, no matter their status, should be treated with fairness and dignity. Diane's face flushed as she struggled to form a response. But you must understand it looked suspicious at first. How was I supposed to know who you were? Grace tilted her head slightly. Why did you assume I did not belong? The simple question hit Diane harder than she expected. Her lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but no answer came. The silence that followed felt heavy, as though the entire room held its breath. Mr. Caldwell took a step forward. "Mrs. Cooper," he said firmly, "I have already assured you that Miss Hamilton's credentials are beyond question. There is no reason for further doubt." Diane bristled, but refused to back down completely. "Fine," she said, crossing her arms, "but anyone could make a fake card like that." Eric couldn't hold back any longer. "Are you serious?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "Do you really think someone would fake being the owner of an entire airline just to sit in a lounge?" Caldwell cleared his throat to prevent things from escalating. "Miss Hamilton," he said apologetically, "I will handle this." Grace nodded but remained seated, calm as ever. She reached into her briefcase once more and pulled out her second form of identification, her executive pass, which bore her photo, signature, and title beneath the airline's logo. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Diane. "Here is another credential," Grace said, her voice as smooth as polished glass. "Would you like to inspect this one as well?" Diane blinked at the card, the weight of her mistake pressing down like a stone. She did not reach for it, though her eyes scanned the unmistakable proof. Caldwell sighed. "Miss Hamilton," he said, turning back to her, "I sincerely apologize for this disruption. I take full responsibility for ensuring our guests and staff uphold the highest standards of respect moving forward." Grace nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Accountability matters, but so does growth. This is an opportunity for all of us to learn." Diane's shoulders slumped slightly as she realized the futility of her defiance. She let out a small, bitter laugh, though it sounded hollow. "Well," she muttered, "you seem to have all the answers." Grace met her gaze, unflinching. "I do not have all the answers, Mrs. Cooper, but I know that respect should not have prerequisites." A few passengers nearby nodded subtly, clearly moved by Grace's words. Diane's bravado finally crumbled, and she muttered something under her breath before turning and walking away for good. Eric let out a slow breath. "Well, that was exhausting," he said, his voice low. Grace gave him a faint smile. "The hardest part is staying true to who you are, even when the world tests you." Caldwell straightened his tie, regaining his professional demeanor. "Miss Hamilton," he said, "I assure you this will not happen again. We will be implementing immediate measures to address this incident." "I appreciate that, Mr. Caldwell," Grace replied. "But meaningful change goes beyond protocols. It starts with understanding why things happen in the first place." Caldwell nodded, looking humbled. "Understood." The hum of the lounge gradually returned as the tension dissolved. Grace noticed Emily standing at the front desk, watching everything unfold with wide eyes. When their gazes met, Emily gave a small, apologetic nod. Grace returned the gesture with a reassuring look, silently conveying that mistakes did not define people, only how they responded to them. Eric sat back in his chair, still processing everything. "How do you do it?" he asked, looking at Grace with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "How do you stay so calm when people like that push you to the edge?" Grace took a slow sip of her coffee, savoring its warmth. "Because I know who I am, Eric," she said simply. "When you know your worth, you do not have to prove it to anyone. You just live it." Eric nodded slowly, his admiration clear. "I hope I can learn that from you." Grace smiled. "You already are." As they returned to their work, the airport announcer's voice crackled through the speakers, signaling the boarding of an earlier flight. Grace glanced out the window, watching as another plane prepared for takeoff. For a brief moment, the doubt in Diane's eyes flashed in her mind. Grace wondered if that doubt might someday blossom into reflection, or if Diane would continue to cling to her entitlement. But Grace knew that wasn't her burden to carry. Her focus was on building something stronger than the ignorance she had just encountered. The storm had passed, for now. But Grace's resilience was built to weather more than one storm, and she knew her journey was far from over. The airport lounge had resumed its hum of normalcy, but Grace Hamilton could still feel the weight of what had transpired. Though Diane Cooper was gone, the encounter lingered like the fading tremors after an earthquake. Grace had spent her entire career rising above moments like these, yet every incident carried the same sting, a reminder that no level of success could fully shield her from prejudice. Eric sat quietly beside her, flipping through his notes with nervous energy. Though Diane's interruption had passed, the tension in the room had left its mark. The passengers nearby had returned to their conversations, but their sidelong glances told Grace that they were still processing what they had witnessed. Mr. Caldwell returned with a composed expression, though his unease was apparent. He cleared his throat as he stopped beside Grace's table. "Miss Hamilton," he began, "once again, I am deeply sorry for everything that happened. We strive to make our lounges places of comfort and respect, and today we failed." Grace looked up, her expression calm but direct. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Caldwell, but apologies, while important, are not enough." Caldwell nodded, his face tightening with understanding. "I agree. We will address this." Grace paused, allowing her words to settle before she continued. "What happened here today was not just about one person's ignorance. It was about assumptions ones that your staff felt compelled to entertain. Emily did not act out of malice, but she hesitated because she was caught between policy and bias. That hesitation is where change is needed." Caldwell's shoulders sank slightly under the weight of her words, but he nodded again. "You are right, Miss Hamilton. I will make sure this incident is documented thoroughly. Emily and the rest of the staff will receive additional training to handle these situations with more professionalism and fairness." Eric glanced up at Caldwell. "It is not just about policies," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It is about creating an environment where assumptions like Diane's do not thrive." Caldwell looked between Grace and Eric, and for the first time, Grace saw not just professional obligation in his expression, but a genuine desire to understand. "Thank you for your honesty," Caldwell said sincerely. "I will make sure this situation leads to real change." "That are what matters," Grace replied with a nod. "If we want progress, we have to confront the discomfort that comes with it." Caldwell excused himself to attend to the staff, leaving Grace and Eric to resume their preparations. Eric sighed, setting down his tablet. "It really feels like you have to fight for respect every step of the way," he muttered. Grace gave him a thoughtful look. "I do," she admitted, "but the fight is not about proving my worth. It is about changing how people see the world, and that kind of change takes time." Eric leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But Diane, she did not seem like the kind of person who learns from moments like this." Grace's gaze drifted toward the glass windows overlooking the runway. A plane was taxiing toward the gate, its engines humming with quiet power. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but that is not something I can control. My focus is on the people who watched and listened. Change does not always happen in the loudest moments. It can start in the quiet shifts of perspective." Eric nodded slowly, as if her words were beginning to take root. At the front desk, Emily was speaking quietly to another attendant. Her posture was stiff, and she kept glancing toward Grace as if replaying the moment over and over in her head. Grace could see the regret etched into her face. Moments later, Emily walked toward Grace's table, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "Miss Hamilton?" she said quietly, her voice trembling. Grace looked up, her expression kind but measured. "Yes, Emily?" Emily's eyes shimmered as she struggled to find the right words. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am." "Again," she began. "I should not have let her push me into that situation. I know better." Grace nodded slowly, We all make mistakes, Emily. What matters is that you recognized it and that you are willing to grow from it. Emily swallowed hard and took a steadying breath. I want to do better. I want to make sure no one else ever feels the way you did today. Grace's expression softened. That is a good place to start. Growth takes more than promises it acts. But you seem ready for that. Emily nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly as relief crossed her face. Thank you, Miss Hamilton. As Emily returned to the front desk, Eric shook his head in amazement. You really do know how to turn situations around, he said. Grace smiled faintly. People need a chance to reflect before they can change. She took that chance. That matters. Eric leaned back in his chair, visibly calmer. You really believe things will get better, don't you? Grace's eyes softened as she looked out at the airport terminal bustling with travelers, people from different walks of life, each carrying their own stories. I believe they can, she said, and that belief keeps me moving forward. The sound of a boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, signaling the departure of another flight. Grace glanced at her watch. There was still time before their flight, but the reminder brought her focus back to the task at hand. We have a meeting to prepare for, Grace said, returning to her notes. Let's make sure we are ready. Eric nodded, his energy shifting back to work mode as he followed her lead. But as they resumed their discussion, Grace felt the ripple of today's events settle into place. The confrontation with Diane had been draining, but it had also sparked something deeper, a chance to reaffirm her purpose and the culture she wanted to build. Across the lounge, Emily straightened her posture and greeted the next guest with a warm, confident smile. Grace noticed and felt a quiet satisfaction. Small steps, Grace murmured to herself. Eric glanced up. What was that? Grace smiled. Change happens in small steps, Eric. But those small steps add up. The weight of the day began to ease as they continued their work. Grace knew that challenges like today's would come again, they always did. But she also knew that every challenge was an opportunity to plant the seeds of something stronger, something better. And as long as she could take those small steps forward, she would continue to build a world where fairness, kindness, and resilience outshined prejudice. The hum of the airport lounge seemed softer now, almost reverent, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of the confrontation. Grace Hamilton sat at the corner table with Eric by her side, her calm demeanor restored. But beneath that calm was a quiet resolve, a reminder of why she fought so hard for the company she had built and the values it stood for. Eric, who had always admired Grace's composure, glanced at her as she reviewed the last few pages of their investment proposal. He leaned forward, curiosity tugging at him. You always talk about staying calm and focused, he began, his voice low. But how do you do it? I mean, how do you really keep your composure when people like Diane test you like that? Grace set the report down gently and met Eric's gaze. She took a breath before answering. Resilience is not something you are born with, Eric, she said. It is something you build layer by layer, experience by experience. I did not grow up with privilege. I had to fight for every opportunity and prove myself in rooms where people expected me to fail. I learned that losing control gave others exactly what they wanted, a reason to dismiss me. Eric nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. But isn't it exhausting? He asked. Always having to be the bigger person? A faint smile touched Grace's lips, though her eyes reflected the weariness that came with years of doing exactly that. Yes, she admitted. It is exhausting, but I remind myself why I am doing this. It is not just for me, it is for the people watching, the ones who need to see that there is another way to respond to injustice. If I can handle moments like today with strength and grace, I am paving the way for someone else. Eric leaned back, processing her words. So, you are leading by example, even when it feels unfair. Grace nodded. Exactly. As if on cue, Mr. Caldwell reappeared at their table, looking more composed now, but still humbled by the earlier events. He cleared his throat softly before speaking. "Miss Hamilton, I wanted to update you personally," he began. "I have spoken to Emily and the rest of the team. We will be implementing a revised protocol for how situations like this are handled. We will also be providing additional training focused on inclusivity and professionalism." Grace studied him carefully, sensing the sincerity in his words. "That is a good start, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "But real change requires more than policies. It requires a shift in culture." Caldwell nodded. "I understand. We will work to make that shift. Your feedback today has been invaluable." Grace offered him a small, approving nod. "Thank you for taking this seriously. The goal is not to shame anyone, but to build a stronger, more inclusive team." Caldwell straightened, clearly determined. "You have my word, Miss Hamilton." He paused before adding, "You handled that situation with incredible poise. It was eye-opening." Grace's expression softened. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. But leadership is not just about reacting to moments like these. It is about making sure they happen less often." With a respectful nod, Caldwell excused himself, leaving Grace and Eric once again alone at their table. Eric let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You did not just diffuse the situation, you turned it into a teaching moment," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I doubt anyone else in this lounge will forget what happened today." Grace's gaze drifted to the windows, where another plane was preparing for takeoff. She could see the reflection of the lounge in the glass passengers gathered in quiet conversations. Their attention returned to their own worlds. But there was an undercurrent of change, a subtle awareness that had not been there before. "It is not about making them remember me," Grace said thoughtfully. "It is about making them remember what fairness looks like." Eric nodded, absorbing her words. Then, as if inspired by her example, he straightened and set his tablet down with renewed focus. "All right," he said, his tone determined. "Let us get back to work. That investment meeting is not going to prepare itself." Grace smiled, grateful for Eric's resilience. He had witnessed something important today, a reminder that leadership was not just about strategy or profits, but about character and integrity. The two of them resumed their discussion, reviewing the proposal with precision and purpose. Time passed in quiet productivity until the final draft was polished and ready. Eric looked over the last slide on the tablet and nodded in satisfaction. "We are good to go," he said. "This presentation is rock solid." Grace closed the document and leaned back slightly, allowing herself a moment of calm. "Good work, Eric. You handled yourself well today." Eric's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Thanks, Miss Hamilton. But you were the one who showed me how to handle it." Grace's smile deepened. "That is what mentorship is about. Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest days." Eric was about to respond when a soft, familiar voice interrupted them. "Miss Hamilton?" They both looked up to see Emily standing near their table again. This time, her posture was less tense, and though she still seemed nervous, there was a determined light in her eyes. "Emily," Grace said kindly, gesturing for her to step closer, "what can I do for you?" Emily took a breath and stepped forward. "I just wanted to thank you again," she said earnestly. "Not just for your patience, but for how you handled everything. It made me realize that I can do better. I want to do better, not just in my job, but as a person." Grace's heart swelled with quiet pride. She could see that this was more than a simple apology. It was a commitment to change. "I am glad to hear that, Emily," Grace said. "The first step toward growth is recognizing where we can improve. The next step is action." Emily nodded, her expression brightening. "I will not forget that." As Emily walked away, Eric shook his head in wonder. "You turned her into an advocate for change in one day," he said, amazed. "You really are something else." Grace chuckled softly. It is not about me, Eric. It is about what happens when we give people the chance to rise to their potential. Eric smiled, visibly inspired. I am learning more from you than I ever expected. Grace took a sip of her coffee, savoring the calm after the storm. That is what good leadership should do. The lounge's speakers crackled as the boarding announcement for their flight echoed through the room. Grace and Eric gathered their belongings and made their way toward the gate, their footsteps steady and sure. As they walked, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been a test of patience and resilience, but it had also been a chance to reinforce the values she held close. Leadership, she knew, was not defined by titles or power. It was defined by how one navigated the storms, not with force, but with grace. And as the jet bridge stretched out before her, leading to her next journey, Grace knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Grace Hamilton settled into her seat in first class. The cool leather felt familiar beneath her, a comforting contrast to the turbulence of the day. Eric took the seat beside her, adjusting his tie before placing his tablet neatly on the tray table. He glanced at Grace, his brow still furrowed with lingering thoughts. "You know," he said, fastening his seatbelt, "what happened back in the lounge? It was a masterclass in leadership. But if I'm being honest, I'm still trying to figure out how you kept your cool." Grace smiled faintly and leaned back. "You are not the first person to ask me that, Eric," she said. "It is something I had to learn the hard way. There were times early in my career when I did not handle things as gracefully. I let anger get the better of me because I thought showing strength meant being unyielding. But I learned that true power comes from knowing when to stand firm and when to show restraint." Eric nodded, but still looked thoughtful. "I get that. But there was something about Diane. The way she spoke to you, the way she refused to admit she was wrong, it was infuriating. I do not know how you did not let it get under your skin." Grace's gaze shifted to the window, where the airport runway stretched out like a ribbon of endless possibility. "Oh, it got under my skin," she admitted softly. "But anger only takes up space if you let it. I remind myself that I cannot control what people like Diane do or think, but I can control how I respond. And if I lose control, I am giving them power they never deserved in the first place." Eric absorbed her words, his admiration growing. "That makes sense," he said after a moment. "But I still think it takes a special kind of strength to stay calm like that." Grace smiled again, though there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Strength is not just about staying calm, Eric. It is about knowing why you are doing what you do. My purpose keeps me steady." The intercom crackled as the flight attendant began the pre-flight announcements, but Eric seemed too engrossed in the conversation to notice. "What do you mean by purpose?" he asked, genuinely curious. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice thoughtful. "When I started Horizon Airways, I was not just building a business. I was building a legacy, a space where people from all walks of life could feel seen, valued, and respected. I wanted to show the world that a Black woman could create something that not only succeeded, but set the standard for excellence. That purpose guides me, even when the world tests me." Eric's eyes softened as he listened. "You are not just running an airline," he said quietly. "You are creating something bigger than yourself." Grace nodded. "Exactly." The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Grace took a deep breath as the familiar pull of acceleration began. The engines roared to life, and soon the plane lifted off the ground, ascending into the open sky. Grace always felt a quiet sense of awe during takeoff, a reminder of how far she had come. As the plane leveled out, the flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Miss Hamilton, Mr. Daniels, can I get you anything to drink?" "Just water for me, thank you," Grace replied. Eric ordered a coffee, and once the flight attendant left, he turned to Grace again. "Today made me realize something," Eric said. "People like Diane are out there in every room, every meeting. You have to deal with that kind of scrutiny all the time, do you not? Grace nodded. Yes, I do. But I choose to see it as a responsibility, not just a burden. I know people are watching, waiting to see how I handle things. And if I can show them a better way, maybe they will think twice the next time they see someone different from them in a position of power. Eric exhaled slowly, his admiration evident. You make it sound so simple, but I know it is not. It is not, Grace agreed, but it is worth it. Their drinks arrived, and Grace sipped her water thoughtfully. The memory of Emily's nervous apology at the lounge replayed in her mind, and she felt a quiet sense of hope. People like Emily give me hope, Grace said, as if reading Eric's mind. She made a mistake, but she wanted to do better. That is where change begins, with the people willing to listen and grow. Eric stirred his coffee, nodding. I noticed that too. She looked scared at first, but by the end, she seemed different, more confident. Grace smiled. That is the power of grace, Eric. When we show people kindness instead of condemnation, we give them room to grow into their potential. Eric leaned back in his seat, a thoughtful silence settling between them as the plane soared above the clouds. After a few moments, Eric spoke again. You know, this whole thing today made me realize that I have some growing to do too. I got so caught up in my frustration that I almost made things worse. Grace reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. We are all learning, Eric. The fact that you can recognize that means you are already growing. Eric smiled, looking reassured. Thanks, Miss Hamilton. I mean it. The rest of the flight passed in quiet reflection and conversation about the upcoming meeting. When the captain announced their descent, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose settle over her. Today's challenges had tested her resolve, but they had also reaffirmed her mission. As the plane landed smoothly on the Dallas runway, Grace looked out the window at the sunlit tarmac. She thought of Diane's defiance, Emily's apology, and Eric's growth. Each moment had been part of a larger story, one that spoke of resilience, fairness, and the quiet power of leading with integrity. When the plane taxied to the gate, Grace gathered her briefcase and smiled at Eric. Ready? Eric nodded, his expression steadier than it had been earlier. Ready. As they stepped off the plane and into the terminal, Grace knew that the meeting ahead was only one chapter of the day's journey. The work she had done and the lessons she had shared would ripple far beyond the walls of any boardroom. Because for Grace, leadership was not just about ambition or success. It was about creating a world where people like Eric, Emily, and countless others could thrive, not because of who they were expected to be, but because of who they chose to become. The Dallas terminal buzzed with movement as Grace Hamilton and Eric walked briskly toward the car, waiting to take them to the investment meeting. The early afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Grace felt the familiar hum of anticipation in her chest, the quiet yet steady focus that always preceded a big presentation. Eric stayed close, his steps purposeful, but his expression thoughtful. Despite their preparation, Grace could tell his mind was still lingering on the events at the airport lounge. As they exited the terminal and stepped into the warm Texas air, Eric's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. Miss Hamilton, he said carefully, I think you need to see this. He handed her the phone. The screen displayed an article from a popular blog, complete with a headline that made Grace's stomach turn. Public humiliation at the lounge. When power goes too far. Beneath it was Diane Cooper's version of the story, a skewed narrative designed to paint herself as the victim. In her post, Diane accused Grace of flaunting her power, twisting the events to suggest that Grace had used her position to embarrass her in front of other passengers. The comments section was already filling up, some with sympathy for Diane, others skeptical of her account. Eric ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. Of course she did, he muttered. She is doubling down. Grace read through the post slowly, her expression calm but reflective. She had dealt with public spin before, but seeing someone so blatantly distort the truth still stirred something deep within her. She handed the phone back to Eric and took a steadying breath. She was always going to do this, Grace said. People like Diane cannot stand being wrong, so they rewrite the story to make themselves the hero. Eric frowned. What do we do now? This could damage the company's reputation if it gains traction. Grace thought for a moment, her mind clear despite the rising stakes. We respond with facts, not emotion. We stay calm, just like we did in the lounge. Eric nodded slowly, though his concern lingered. I will alert the communications team. We can issue a statement. Grace placed a hand on his arm. Make sure it is backed by the truth. Attach the security footage and the witness statements if needed. Our goal is not to retaliate. It is to reinforce our values. Eric's shoulders relaxed slightly as he absorbed her words. Got it. I will handle it. By the time they reached the waiting car, Eric had already sent an email to the communications department. As they settled into their seats, Grace stared out the window, watching the city blur past. Eric broke the silence hesitantly. Does it ever feel overwhelming, knowing that people like Diane have a platform to spread lies? Grace turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. It used to, she admitted. But I realized something over the years. Truth has a way of rising to the surface, even when it is buried beneath lies. It takes patience, but if you stay consistent, the truth wins. Eric's expression softened. I hope you are right. The car pulled into the driveway of the sleek corporate building where the investment meeting was being held. Grace adjusted her blazer and grabbed her briefcase. I am, she said, giving him a small, reassuring smile. Now let's focus. We have work to do. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was formal but energetic. A long glass table stretched the length of the room, surrounded by a dozen executives who greeted Grace and Eric with polite nods. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, but Grace's focus was laser-sharp. Eric connected their presentation to the monitor as Grace exchanged handshakes and pleasantries. When everyone was seated, she stood at the head of the table, exuding a calm authority. Good afternoon, Grace began, her voice steady and clear. Thank you all for your time. Today, I am excited to share Horizon Airways' vision for the next chapter of our growth. The presentation unfolded seamlessly. Grace spoke with confidence, outlining their plans for expanding routes, improving sustainability practices, and enhancing customer experiences. Her passion for her work was evident in every word, and Eric followed her lead, delivering his portions with precision. When the final slide appeared, the room was quiet for a brief moment before erupting into applause. The lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Park, leaned forward with a smile. That was outstanding, Linda said. It is clear that Horizon Airways is not just growing, it is setting the standard for the entire industry. Grace nodded graciously. Thank you. Our goal is not only to lead, but to create an experience that reflects our core values of respect, innovation, and inclusivity. Linda's smile widened. And it shows. I have no doubts about supporting this vision. As the meeting concluded, Eric shot Grace a discreet thumbs up as they exited the boardroom. Once they were outside, he let out a deep breath. That went better than I could have hoped, he said. Grace chuckled softly. A good plan, well executed, makes all the difference. Eric's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the notification. His eyes widened. You are not going to believe this. Diane's post is backfiring. Grace raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Eric showed her his phone. The comments section had shifted dramatically. Many users were now questioning Diane's version of events, referencing eyewitness accounts that contradicted her claims. Others praised Grace's professionalism and pointed out that Horizon Airways had a reputation for fairness and integrity. A small but genuine smile formed on Grace's face. "The truth is rising, Eric." Eric laughed, shaking his head in amazement. "It really is. Our statement is getting positive feedback too. People are applauding how calm and clear we were." Grace nodded, satisfied but not surprised. When you lead with integrity, people notice. As they returned to the car, Eric's admiration was unmistakable. "You did not just survive that situation, you turned it into an opportunity for people to see who you really are." Grace looked out the window as the city lights began to shimmer in the twilight. "That is the goal, Eric," she said softly. "Leadership is not about perfection. It is about showing people how to navigate challenges with resilience and purpose." The car moved smoothly through the evening traffic, and Grace felt a quiet peace settle over her. The ripples from the lounge incident had traveled further than she had expected, but instead of harm, they had spread a message of strength and fairness. As they pulled up to their hotel, Eric gathered his things and glanced at Grace. "What do you think Diane will do next?" Grace's gaze was steady as she opened the car door. "That is not our concern anymore," she said. "What matters is that we stayed true to who we are." Eric nodded, visibly inspired by her unwavering resolve. "You are right." Grace smiled as they stepped inside. "Come on. We have earned some rest." As the doors to the elevator closed behind them, Grace felt a renewed sense of hope. The truth had taken its rightful place, and the work they had done today would ripple far beyond this moment. Because leadership, she knew, was not just about weathering storms, it was about creating waves of change that would outlast them. The morning sunlight filtered through the hotel room's sheer curtains as Grace Hamilton sat at the small desk, sipping her coffee and scrolling through emails. The quiet hum of the city below was a comforting contrast to the turbulence of the previous day. As she reviewed the latest company updates, a new message caught her attention. The subject line read, "Thank you for your grace." Curious, she opened the email and immediately recognized the sender, Emily, the young lounge attendant from the airport. "Dear Miss Hamilton, I wanted to reach out and thank you personally for how you handled everything at the lounge. I have thought about that moment over and over, and it has changed how I see my role not just as an attendant, but as someone who can make people feel respected and welcomed. You could have responded with anger or judgment, but instead, you showed kindness and strength. You reminded me that mistakes do not define us, what we do after them does. I have already signed up for additional training on handling difficult situations, and I have spoken to my supervisor about ways we can foster a more inclusive culture in our lounge. You taught me more in one afternoon than any training session ever could. I am committed to being better, not just because it is my job, but because it is the right thing to do. Thank you for being an example of what true leadership looks like. Sincerely, Emily Parker." Grace's eyes softened as she read Emily's words. She let the message sink in, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. It was a small but powerful reminder that even the most uncomfortable moments could lead to growth, not just for herself, but for others. Eric knocked lightly on the door before stepping in, a cup of coffee in hand. "Morning, Miss Hamilton," he greeted with a smile. "You are up early." Grace returned his smile. "Habit," she replied. "Besides, I had an interesting email to read." Eric sat at the small lounge chair and raised an eyebrow. "Good news, I hope?" Grace turned her laptop toward him so he could read the email. As Eric skimmed the message, his expression shifted from curiosity to admiration. "Wow," he said, sitting back. "She really took your words to heart." Grace nodded. "It is moments like this that remind me why I do what I do. Change happens when people like Emily choose to rise above their mistakes and take action." Eric exhaled thoughtfully. "It is impressive. Most people would have just apologized and moved on, but she is actually trying to grow." "Exactly," Grace said. "It is not just about making amends, It is about committing to being better. Eric leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Do you think people like Diane will ever get to that point? Grace's smile dimmed slightly, though her gaze remained thoughtful. People like Diane cling to their pride and privilege because admitting they were wrong feels like losing control. I do not know if she will ever change, but that is not something I can control. What I can control is the example I set. Eric nodded slowly. You really believe that small changes can ripple outward, don't you? Grace's smile returned. I have seen it happen too many times not to believe it. Eric's phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the screen and sat up straighter. The comms team just sent me a summary. The response to our statement has been overwhelmingly positive. People are praising how we handled the situation. And get this, the security footage is going viral, but in a good way. People are calling you an example of grace under pressure. Grace shook her head with a soft chuckle. Well, I suppose there are worse things to be known for. Eric grinned. You are inspiring people. Even the comments on Diane's post have flipped. The truth really does have a way of rising. Grace took another sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle. It is not just about defending my reputation, it is about reinforcing what we stand for. If our story helps even one person see things differently, then it was worth it. Eric nodded and tapped away at his phone, firing off a few responses to the communications team. By the way, he said, glancing up, there is more good news. The head of the diversity and inclusion team finalized the training materials you requested. They are ready to launch. Grace's eyes brightened. That is great news. Let's make sure they are implemented without delay. Eric's phone buzzed again, but this time his expression softened as he read the notification. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. There is something else, he said carefully. Emily posted on the company's internal forum about what happened. She shared what she learned and how much she admires you. It is getting a lot of attention, positive attention. Grace's brows lifted in surprise. She did? Eric nodded. She did not name Diane directly, but she talked about how assumptions can lead to unfair treatment and how important it is to lead with empathy. She even mentioned the training she signed up for and encouraged her coworkers to do the same. Grace felt a swell of pride in her chest. Emily had taken a moment of failure and turned it into a movement for change. Eric smiled. Looks like you started something bigger than you thought. Grace leaned back, a sense of calm settling over her. Emily started it, she corrected. I just gave her room to grow. Eric watched her with admiration. You really do see the best in people, don't you? Grace's gaze softened. I try to, but seeing the best in people also means holding them accountable. You cannot have one without the other. Eric nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. It is not about avoiding conflict. It is about using it to build something better. Grace smiled. Exactly. The morning unfolded with a quiet rhythm as Grace and Eric finalized their plans for the day. The ripple effect of the lounge incident had already begun spreading further than Grace had imagined, but she welcomed it. The conversations that arose from moments like these were where real progress began. Later that afternoon, as they prepared to leave the hotel for their next meeting, Eric hesitated at the door. Miss Hamilton, he said, his voice thoughtful. Yes? Eric took a breath. Thanks for showing me how leadership can be about more than just making decisions. It is about how you make people feel. Grace's smile was warm and genuine. You are starting to sound like a leader yourself, Eric. Eric chuckled softly. I learned from the best. As they stepped out into the sunlit street, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. Diane's narrative had tried to distort the truth, but the truth had stood its ground. And more importantly, it had planted seeds of growth in people like Emily, people who would go on to make their own ripples of change. Because leadership, Grace knew, was never just about one person. It was about building something that would last long after you were gone, something rooted in resilience, kindness, and unwavering hope. The conference room buzzed with quiet anticipation as employees filed in, their conversations hushed but curious. Word had spread quickly through Horizon Airways about the lounge incident. While the official statement had clarified the facts, it was the personal testimonies from Emily's post to first-hand accounts that had shaped the narrative into something deeper. At the front of the room, Grace Hamilton stood poised, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. The glass walls of the room reflected the golden glow of the late afternoon sun, framing her silhouette like a portrait of calm authority. Eric stood off to the side, watching her with quiet admiration. After years of working by her side, he knew that this meeting was more than just a formality. It was a chance for Grace to reinforce what she had always believed. Leadership was about empathy, accountability, and truth. Grace glanced across the room, meeting the eyes of her team members. Some looked nervous, others inspired. She had always believed that vulnerability was a strength, not a weakness. And today, she was prepared to share her story with honesty. She cleared her throat softly and began. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Before we dive into today's agenda, I want to address something important. As many of you know, there was an incident at the airport lounge a few days ago. It was a moment that tested not just me, but the values this company stands for." The room grew quieter as Grace continued, her words deliberate but sincere. "Being a leader does not make me immune to prejudice or assumptions. Despite everything I have accomplished, I am still seen by some as someone who does not belong. But that moment in the lounge was not just about me. It was about what we do as a company when faced with bias and misunderstanding." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "I want to be clear, mistakes happen, but growth only comes when we acknowledge those mistakes and learn from them. Emily, the lounge attendant who approached me that day, made a mistake, but she also showed us what accountability and growth look like. She chose to reflect, to listen, and to change. That is the kind of leadership I hope we all strive for." A few heads nodded, and Grace saw a flicker of agreement in the room. She took a breath and continued. "But there is another part of that story that I need to share," she said, her tone softening. "It is about resilience, about choosing how to respond when the world questions your right to be where you are." She paused again, letting her vulnerability show. "There have been times in my career when I felt exhausted by the constant need to prove myself, times when I wondered if staying calm in the face of injustice was worth it. But I realized something important. When I stay calm and hold true to my values, I am not just standing up for myself, I am standing up for everyone who has felt unseen or underestimated." Eric shifted slightly, the emotion in the room palpable. Grace's words resonated with him on a deeper level now, especially after seeing how she had navigated the storm with such composure. Grace straightened, her voice gaining quiet strength. "As a company, our mission is not just to be a leader in aviation. It is to set an example of fairness, respect, and inclusion. That means we hold ourselves to the highest standards, not because it looks good, but because it is the right thing to do." A hand rose from the back of the room, a young employee with wide eyes and a hesitant smile. "Miss Hamilton," she asked nervously, "how do you stay hopeful when things like that happen? I mean, how do you keep believing that change is possible?" Grace's expression softened. "That is a good question," she said. "The truth is, it is not always easy, but I stay hopeful because I have seen change happen. Sometimes it starts with something as small as an apology or a conversation. Sometimes it starts with someone like Emily saying, 'I can do better.' Small actions add up. They ripple outward. That is how change takes root." The young woman nodded thoughtfully, and Grace continued. "Hope is not just a feeling, it is a choice. I choose to believe that we can create a better world because if I stop believing, I stop trying. And if I stop trying, nothing will ever change. The room was still, the air filled with a quiet reverence. Eric cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. Miss Hamilton, he said, I think everyone here has learned something important from you, not just about leadership, but about resilience. Grace smiled, gratitude softening her features. Thank you, Eric. But resilience is not something that belongs to one person. It belongs to all of us. Every time you choose kindness over cynicism, every time you choose to listen instead of judge, you are building resilience. And that is what makes a company strong, not just its profits, but its people. She took a step away from the podium, signaling the end of her address. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this journey. Let us hold each other accountable, but let us also support each other, because that is how we move forward together. A wave of quiet applause filled the room, not thunderous, but meaningful. It was the sound of respect, not obligation. As people began to file out, many stopped to thank Grace personally, some sharing stories of how her words had resonated with their own experiences. The young employee who had asked the question lingered near the door. Grace approached her with a warm smile. Thank you for your question, Grace said. It takes courage to ask something so honest. The woman smiled shyly. Thank you, Miss Hamilton. I really needed to hear what you said. Grace nodded. I am glad. Remember, you have the power to be part of that change. As the employee left, Eric walked over, his expression thoughtful. I do not think anyone in that room will ever forget today, he said. Grace picked up her notes and gave him a small, hopeful smile. Good, she said simply. That means we are on the right path. As they stepped into the hallway, the sun cast a warm glow through the windows, painting the floor with golden light. Grace felt a sense of peace, but also resolve. The work was not over. It never really would be. But today, they had taken another step toward the kind of company and world they wanted to build. Because leadership, Grace knew, was not just about enduring the storms. It was about inspiring others to walk with you through them and showing them that there was light on the other side. Months had passed since the incident at the lounge, but its lessons had taken root and flourished. Horizon Airways had rolled out a company-wide training program focused on inclusivity, empathy, and leadership. The initiative was more than a policy, it was a movement, shaped by real stories like Grace's. Grace Hamilton stood at the airport terminal once again, her gaze fixed on the familiar bustle of travelers coming and going. The air buzzed with the sound of rolling suitcases, flight announcements, and cheerful goodbyes. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase, taking a steadying breath as memories from that fateful day resurfaced. But this time, it felt different. The tension she had felt walking into the lounge months ago had been replaced by something lighter, an unexpected sense of belonging. Eric, standing beside her, checked his watch and smiled. You know, he said, it is strange coming back here after everything, but it feels good. Grace nodded. It does. As they entered the first-class lounge, Grace immediately noticed the shift in energy. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, the smiles of the staff genuine and unforced. She walked in with quiet confidence, her presence drawing the attention of a few passengers, but this time there were no whispers, no sidelong glances filled with suspicion. Instead, there were nods of recognition and admiration. At the front desk, Emily Parker, now a supervisor, stood with a professional but relaxed posture. When she noticed Grace, her face lit up with a smile. Miss Hamilton, Emily greeted, her voice steady and confident. Welcome back, Grace smiled warmly. Thank you, Emily. It is good to be back. Emily stepped out from behind the desk and approached with an eager but respectful demeanor. Can I take a moment to thank you again? Emily asked. I know I have said it before, but that day changed my life. After everything that happened, I realized how much I wanted to grow, not just as an employee, but as a leader. And then, well, I have you to thank for that. Grace placed a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. You did the hard work, Emily, she said. I just gave you a chance to see your own potential. Emily's smile widened. I hope I can do the same for others. You already are, Grace said. Emily nodded and gestured toward the lounge. We have a table ready for you near the window, the best seat in the house. Grace chuckled. Thank you, but I think any seat is perfect as long as I have coffee. Emily laughed and motioned for one of her attendants to bring over a fresh pot. Grace and Eric took their seats, the view of the planes taking off and landing stretching out before them like a scene from a well-written story. Eric glanced around the room, his expression thoughtful. The whole place feels different, he said. People seem more at ease, even the staff, especially Emily. Grace followed his gaze, noticing how Emily calmly managed her team, offering guidance and praise with quiet assurance. She moved with the kind of purpose Grace had always believed in, strong, steady, and driven by values rather than ego. That is the power of kindness, Grace said. When you create an environment where people feel valued, they pass that energy on to others. Eric took a sip of his coffee and leaned back. I never told you this, he began, his voice quieter, but that day at the lounge changed me too. I used to think leadership was about being decisive and getting things done, no matter what. But you taught me that it is also about how you treat people when no one is watching and when everyone is watching. Grace's expression softened. That means a lot to hear, Eric. You have always had the potential to be a great leader, you just needed to see yourself the way others do. Eric smiled, a little sheepish. I am getting there. As they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, a soft murmur rose from the lounge entrance. Grace glanced up and saw a woman entering, a familiar face. Diane Cooper. Eric stiffened slightly, but Grace remained calm, observing. Diane had changed her hair and wore a more understated outfit, but her expression was unmistakable pride, tinged with something else. Regret? Diane's eyes scanned the room and landed on Grace. For a moment, they locked eyes. Diane hesitated, her shoulders shifting as if unsure whether to walk over or look away. Then, to Eric's surprise, Diane approached. Miss Hamilton, Diane began, her voice quieter than before, but still carrying that familiar edge of uncertainty. Grace set down her cup and met Diane's gaze with an even expression. Mrs. Cooper. Diane shifted her handbag nervously. I just wanted to say something. She took a breath. I am not proud of how I acted that day. I told myself that I was standing up for what was right, but deep down, I know I was wrong. Eric's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but Grace's expression remained calm. She waited, giving Diane space to continue. Diane's gaze faltered. I guess I wanted to apologize. It took me a long time to admit it to myself, but you didn't deserve any of that. I was wrong. Grace studied Diane carefully, searching for sincerity, and she saw it. There was no arrogance in Diane's posture now, only vulnerability. Thank you for saying that, Grace said softly. Apologies matter, but what you do next matters even more. Diane nodded, blinking quickly as though holding back emotion. I know. I am trying to be better. Grace offered a small, understanding smile. That is where real change begins, with trying. Diane's face softened, and she gave a small nod before turning to leave. Eric watched her go, shaking his head in disbelief. That was unexpected, he muttered. Grace smiled faintly. Sometimes people surprise you. Eric exhaled. Do you think she will change for good? Grace's gaze drifted toward the window, where a plane was lifting off into the blue sky. I do not know, she admitted. But whether she does or not, we have already created something stronger than her assumptions. Eric nodded, his admiration for Grace growing even deeper. As the minutes passed, They resumed their conversation, but there was an undeniable shift in the air, one of resilience, forgiveness, and growth. The world had not changed overnight, but Grace knew that every step forward mattered. When it was time to board their flight, Emily walked them to the gate personally. "Safe travels, Miss Hamilton," she said. "Thank you, Emily," Grace replied warmly, "and keep leading with kindness." Emily smiled, her confidence shining through. "I will." As Grace and Eric walked down the jet bridge, the familiar hum of the airplane greeted them. Grace took her seat by the window, watching as the runway stretched out before them. The engines rumbled to life, and the plane began its ascent. Eric glanced at Grace, his voice steady. "You really did change the story, Miss Hamilton." Grace's eyes softened as she looked out at the sky unfolding before them. "No, Eric," she said. "We changed it together." The plane soared higher, breaking through the clouds, and as the world below grew smaller, Grace felt an unshakable sense of hope. The journey was far from over, but she knew that resilience, kindness, and purpose would carry her through whatever came next, because justice was not a moment, it was a journey, and Grace Hamilton was determined to walk it every step of the way. Grace Hamilton's story is a powerful reminder that resilience, kindness, and integrity have the power to change lives, not just our own, but the lives of those around us. In a world that often tests our strength, how we respond defines the legacy we leave behind. If this story inspired you, made you reflect, or encouraged you to see challenges as opportunities for growth, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, resilience, and justice that uplift and empower. And do not forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story that reminds us that together we can make the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.